Okay, welcome everybody, and a greeting from the heat of Texas to wherever you are on this globe. This is the July webinar of FinnFest 2021, FinnFest USA 2021 virtual lecture series. We continue today with actually two lectures. We have Eila Stepanova and Frog, who both give a lecture, and we will then have a question and answer session at the end of both after both lectures. So when you think of a question, you can just write the question on the Q&A space there at the bottom of your screen. There's also the chat available if you need to communicate something to the panelists or the moderators. So my name is Helena Halmari, and my co-moderator is Scott Kaukonen. We are both from Sam Houston State University and Journal of Finnish Studies, the co-sponsors with FinnFest for these virtual lecture series. I do want to remind you of the music series that is every other month. So next month in August, August 28th, there is a music series by Eila Plattonen. And he will be talking about his Finnish-American musical journey. So make sure you register, and that way you'll get the links and the passcodes. These lectures and the music series, these are free for everybody. We do recommend that you, or we wish that you could donate a little bit of something to FinnFest on the FinnFest webpage. Another practical issue is that we will have there on the FinnFest page. Let me just see if I can quickly share this screen. So here is the FinnFest webpage, and you've got the list of the remaining lectures and music series programs. So next month we have Eila Plattonen, My Finnish-American Musical Life, and we also have resources available. So if you click this link, you'll get to the resources, and after Eila's and Frog's lectures, we will be posting in a few days. We will be posting resources. So if you want to read a little bit more about the topics and learn more about the topics, that's a good place to go and check that link. And here we have the past lecture recordings if you missed a lecture. So let's get started. Any questions, put them on chat, and questions to the question and answer session. So let me introduce our first speaker to you. We have Eila Stepanova, and the topic of her talk is Women's Laments alongside the Kalevala, Forgotten Symbols of Finland's Nation Building. This is going to be really a fascinating talk because most people have heard about the Kalevala, but there is this other genre, which is a poetry genre, and that's what Eila will be talking to us about. Eila Stepanova is a Finnish folklorist specializing on Karelian and more broadly on North Finnic lament poetry. She received her doctoral degree at the University of Helsinki. She is recognized as the foremost active expert on Karelian laments in the world, and as an expert on Karelian culture, more specifically, more generally, with a variety of field work experience. Eila is currently Executive Director of the Society of Karelian Culture, and we're very happy to have her here from her summer cottage in Salo, Finland. Welcome, Eila, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I would like to thank all organizers. This is wonderful events. So wonderful that we can connect with each other from all around the world and participate in discussion without the need of traveling anywhere. So just a second. And I would like especially to thank Helena Halmari for all of her work. She put contacting us, and we are so busy sometimes we are not answering the emails immediately. So thank you, Helena, for all of your work. Thank you. And it's wonderful to be here in summer Finland cottage. We have a log cottage, which is very nice. It's evening already, so I hope it's not very dark here. It's after 7 o'clock. So in my lecture, I will discuss Karelian laments in the context of national romanticism in Finland, starting from the 19th century up to the present day, beginning with Elias Lönnrot, who was also the very first collector of this tradition of women's poetry. In the context of national romanticism in 1800s, this genre of traditional poetry was important in Finland's nation building project, but has been forgotten in the shadow of Lönnrot's Kalevala. Everyone nowadays knows the Kalevala, everyone in Finland and probably more generally around the globe. You recognize it as something positive and important, even if you've never read it. But someone mentions lament or lamenting, on the other hand, it sounds like something very sad. If you look at the synonyms for lamenting, lament sounds like something boring or gloomy or bitter, or like it might be just pitiful groaning. Similarly, something lamentable is something very bad and deserving severe criticism. All of those sorts of associations are quite far from the glory of Kalevala and from the images that the word Kalevala brings to mind. However, in my talk today, I will show how beautiful lamenting and laments are, how meaningful they were and still are for the people who perform them, and how important they also were for the creation of the Finnish nation. But before I begin my talk, I thought it would be nice to tell you a bit about how I am connected with lament poetry. I am Karelian myself. I was born in the USSR in the Republic of Karelia. Both of my grandmothers were lamenters. However, my mother, Eila Stepanova, chose a different path. She became a researcher of Karelian lament poetry. I, in my turn, decided to follow in my mother's footsteps and became a second generation lament researcher. During my mother's career, she not only published the results of her research, but also recorded laments on more than 50 fieldwork trips. I am still far, far away from her achievements. Today, first, I would like to provide you with some background information about Karelians and Karelia, and generally to answer the question, why I am talking about Karelia and Karelians when the topic of my lecture is Finland and Finnishness. Then I will introduce you to Karelian laments, their language and meanings, and in the third part of my talk, I will talk about Karelian Lamenters in Finland. I will illustrate each of these topics with different stories about different women. Karelia is a transnational territory in both Finland and Russia. And Karelians are distinct ethnic group with their own language and culture who have always lived within the present national borders of both Finland and Russia. This large area is now populated by multiple ethnic groups, including Finns, Russians, Ukrainians, and Karelians. Until around 1930s, the majority population was Karelian, with their own distinctive language and culture. Today, however, Karelians have been largely assimilated to Russian or Finnish cultures, and the Karelian language, with its three main dialects, is highly endangered. This map on the slide represents the areas where you can find Karelian-speaking population today. Numbers of Karelians in Finland have greatly increased through immigration. The first wave of immigration from Karelia was around 1920s, after the Russian Revolution and Heimosodat, the wars of kindred peoples. At that time, around 20 or 30,000 refugees moved to Finland, which was approximately 1% of population of Finland. Then in 1944, Finland lost a large part of Finnish Karelia to the USSR, and over 400,000 evacuees were relocated to Finland, which was approximately 11% of the population of Finland. And among those people, approximately 30,000 were ethnically Karelians. The third wave of immigration started after the 1990s. About 25,000 people from the Republic of Karelia moved to Finland, including myself. Ethnically, it was a diverse group. Among those were Ingrian Finns, Karelians, and Russians. There are many Karelias, depending on whom you are asking. For some people, Karelia is only the area around the Lake Ladoga and parts of the Karelian Isthmus lost by Finland after World War II. And pardon me for my poor drawing skills on the computer, but you can see the drawings there on the map. For others, true Karelia is the region called Vienna Karelia in the north, the so-called mythic cradle of ancient Finnish culture and history. Or it might be called Eastern Karelia or Russian Karelia, meaning the territories of the Russian side of today's borders. But some people also think that the only Karelia is situated inside the present borders of Finland in the southeast in Joensuu or Lappeenranta. These regions are called in Finnish Northern Karelia and Southern Karelia, and people there speak southeast dialects of Finnish language. So the whole picture of who Karelians are and what Karelia is turns out to be as messy as my drawings here. How many Karelians are there now? In Russia, there are about 61,000 Karelians. In Finland, it's more complicated. There are around 11,000 speakers of Karelian language, its different dialects, but nobody knows how many people have a strong Karelian ethnic cultural identity based, for example, on their family heritage. Traditions collected in Russian Karelia, so-called Russian Karelia, were crucially important for building Finnish identity or Finnishness during the era of national romanticism in the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was a strong idea to search for ancient, authentic culture, a search that looked to uneducated peasants, the folk, as the people among whom such ancient culture could be still found. Folklore and the other things related to the folk and peasant culture provided the most cherished symbols for establishing the nations in Europe at that time, a trend that was also prominent in Finland. Before the rise of national romanticism, in some of the European travelogues, for example, Karelians were viewed negatively as primitive pagans, as dirty, uncivilized, uncivilized and undeveloped. After the 1820s, however, these views started to change due to the growing interest in the ancient history of Finns in connection with Karelia, its past and present culture. Since the 1820s, so-called Russian Karelia was significant for the collection of folklore, especially mythic epic poetry, which made it crucially important for creating the Finnish national epic Kalevala. Elias Lönnrot, one of the most significant collectors of folklore in Finland, created versions of Kalevala as modern literary product from oral folk poems of people of Finland, Karelia, and Ingria, in order to reconstruct ancient Finnish history and culture. Immediately following the publication of its first edition, the Kalevala became extremely meaningful in the creation of Finnish national and ethnic identity within the framework of national romanticism. Already in the process of collecting folk poems from Karelian singers, Elias Lönnrot aimed at translating and adapting the language of the songs in his field notes from Karelian to make them more understandable for him and his audience in Finland. The people who had sung the poems in Karelia to Lönnrot and his fellow collectors were just passive carriers of tradition, and their lives were oriented towards the past. This notion was essential in Karelianism, a cultural movement that emphasized the role of Karelia in the construction of Finnish culture. In Karelianists' terms, Karelia was a channel to bygone days. As one of the Karelianists, Grönqvist, put it, and I quote, "In Russian Karelia, they're among our eastern brothers, all the way behind Lake Ladoga, you can get hold of such a magnifying glass with which anyone can see centuries to the future and to the past," end of quote. In the process of creating and reinforcing Finnish language, culture, and more generally Finnishness, the Karelian language and culture were implicitly absorbed into Finnish cultural heritage. And as a result, nowadays, common public does not differentiate between Finns and Karelians. And this is why I am talking about Karelian folk poetry when we are looking at Finland and Finnishness. Elias Lönnrot, as well as many other collectors of Karelian folklore, were interested not only in Kalevala-like poems, but in other genres of folk poetry and traditions. One of the points of interest of the Finnish elite was the genre of lament poetry. And now we will look more closely at what laments are, who performed them, and why. Laments are sung poetry of various degrees of improvisations, but they follows some rules of traditional verbal expressions. They were most often performed by women, and I would say only by women. They were performed in different ritual contexts and also in different grievous occasions. And laments are one of the oldest and most universal genres of folk poetry. They have been known all over the world and are still found in some cultures of the present day. The Karelian lament tradition has been more or less systematically documented since 1835 by Finnish and Russian Karelian scholars. Finnic lament traditions are primarily preserved in Orthodox areas. There are approximately 5,000 texts of laments preserved in different archives. We have ritual laments connected to funeral, wedding, or conscription to military service or men going to war. We also have different non-ritual laments which are expressing the sadness and grief of lamenters and the whole Karelian community. Thus far, the last documented lament was recorded on video in 2010 by Finnish journalists of the Finnish national broadcast company Yle. Karelian lamenters were mostly illiterate women of rural communities. For the lamenters, laments were part of their life and the life of the community. Laments were necessary for communicating with the other world, with the dead members of the family. They were important for ritual activities during wedding, funerals, and departure ceremonies. And they were very important for expressing feelings of loss and grief in everyday life. The very first laments preserved in the archives, as I said, were collected by Elias Lönnrot in 1835. Lönnrot had heard laments for the first time only the year before, in 1834. This was when he was visiting the most famous Karelian poet, Pirkko Fihlman, in the village of Latvajärvi. And I can quote for you Lönnrot's own description of this scene. And I quote, "When I came to Pirkko, a small child was dying. In the evening, we all went to bed, but the child's mother stayed by his bedside. After sleeping a little while, I was awakened by a piercing, deeply touching, yet ear-splitting crying song, which child's mother started the moment after his death. No one could even think about going back to bed. One could only think about how to save his eardrums. This was more or less bearable, at least when the mother was crying and singing alone. But it did not take long before somebody brought from the neighbors an older, experienced lamenter, whose voice was 7 times more piercing than mother's," end of quote. Then Elias Lönnrot describes the ritual that takes place after somebody's death. In the end of his description, he says, "The whole time, women made this distressing and pained crying song resound again and again. As they cried, they were continuously hugging each other and members of the family. Luckily, I was saved from all of that hugging. This kind of expression of grief is here called crying song or lament. However, I have to leave aside the content of these songs until later." In the following year, in 1835, Lönnrot tried to write down some laments, and I quote, "On April 22nd, which was a Wednesday, I left Rukavaara Pappila almost empty-handed when it comes to collecting Kalevala poems. On the very last day of my stay, I got some laments from old ladies, but they are not of any great value. I've tried to write down some laments before, but I wonder what's wrong, because it doesn't work. It seems that they are of an ancient quality because they contain terrible words, which you cannot understand or comprehend, nor from the first nor from the second time they repeat them. And again, if I ask about some words during the session, then half of what was previously said or written down is forgotten by the lamenter and by the transcriber, so that the text is never complete," end of quote. So here we have Lönnrot, the best collector of folk poetry of the time, who collected thousands and thousands of lines of Kalevala poetry, cannot copy down a single one of these women's songs. So what should we make of this? What was the big deal? How could it be so hard? The problem was that the language of Karelian laments is a sort of secret, coded language that is highly metaphorical. There is no fixed texts. Each lament is unique. Each lament is improvised within the particular situation. There is no fixed meter. So that's why when Lönnrot tried to ask women to repeat something, they just don't repeat the poem because they are making it on the spot. But most important and most prominent feature of Karelian lament is its highly metaphorical formulaic language, which is not easily understandable to outsiders. There are substitute names or words for all relatives, intimate people, objects, and phenomena, and almost nothing is named directly. In lament language, you cannot say simply mother or house or boat or who, I don't know who. Everything is, for everything, there are own substitute names. There is a dictionary of Karelian lament language made by my mother, Eila Stepanova. And this dictionary contains more than 1,400 different circumlocutions for the different objects and people. There are special rules in this language of Karelian laments, and within the rules of the language, lamenters can create different words or those circumlocutions or substitute names. And here are some examples. For example, kantajaiseni, my sweet carrier. Valkia vuoliaiseni, my sweet white cherisher. Those means mother. Simply mother. The mother who is carrying the child, the mother is who is cherishing the child. And the next one also expressed the term mother in more complicated way. Kumpa ne olet kallehilla ilmoilla piällä, 8 kuusien kandeli ja kallis kantajaseni. And note the beautiful alliteration, everything starts with K. One who is into the dear world for 8 dear months, carrier, my dear bringer, just means mother. Kallis kaisla kantamaiseni, my dear club brush, sweet carried one. So carried one is the child. Of course, if mother is a carrier and cherisher, then carried one and cherished one is the child. Kanamaria kantamani, my chickenberry carried one. This special language is probably one of the reasons why lament tradition is disappearing. In order to lament, you have to learn this special language. And why this language was so special? Karelians believed that the people or beings of the other world, the dead members of the family, cannot understand normal spoken language. They understand only this special language of laments. And if you don't use the language of laments, then you cannot communicate with the other world and its beings. Most substitute names are positive. And here are a few more examples. Olka oksaset, dear shoulder branches, means hands. Krustalnoi kuvaset, dear crystal pictures, a mirror. Kultalaita kiekkoset, dear golden-edged discs, means sun, the sun. Piättömät hevoset, dear headless horses, means car. And within the rules of this lament language, lamenter has a freedom to create different new words again and again. And the only negative, usually everything is very positive, but negative is for lamenter herself. She is unhappy woman, poor thing, or tired body, poor thing, and for strangers and grooms, vierahat ottamat, strange taking once, a child of stranger, or under spruce thickets swarmers, spruce thickets animals, which means grooms, retinue, they were viewed negatively. So when this is what the words of lament are like, it becomes easier to understand why Lönnrot had such difficulties trying to write them down. Actually, laments were like speaking in another language, not poems that were learned by heart. So Lönnrot thought lamenters could not remember the poems they were singing, but for the lamenters, they were just telling things in their special language and could say the same thing with different words every time they repeated it. Now, Lönnrot thought traditional poetry was important for ancient knowledge that it might contain. This was very different from why lamenters thought that laments and lamenting were important. To illustrate how meaningful laments were for lamenters, let me tell you a story about a funeral. With this story, I'm going to take you from the 19th century to the 21st century. The main heroine of this story is PRASKOVYA SAVELYEVA, who was known as foremost expert on ritual laments. In the 1970s, my mother met this very talented lamenter. Since 1970s, scholars have recorded approximately 100 different laments from Savelyeva. She was not only a lamenter, but also a storyteller, ritual specialist, and healer, as well as singer of folk songs, both in Karelian and Russian. She was an illiterate woman. During the Second World War, she wasn't able to flee before Finns occupied the area of Soviet Karelia where she lived, and they took her to Finland, where she was forced to work for the Finnish army. And she told me in 1998, she performed her first laments there while washing Finnish soldiers' uniform, when she had no idea what had happened to her family and she was feeling isolated and alone. After the war, she was returned to the Soviet Union. She was married twice, but never had any children. And when folklore collectors first began interviewing her in the 70s, she was a widow, and her laments were mainly about about her own loneliness and that she had never had any children. She was so well known and respected as a lamenter that people from her own and other villages asked her to come and lament at funerals, weddings, and the farewell ceremonies. PRASKOVYA SAVELYEVA died on the 15th of June 2002 in her small village of Mändyselgä in Russian Karelia. Some relatives and neighbors gathered together to say their farewells. By 2002, however, there was no one else left in the area who could perform laments for PRASKOVYA at her funeral. This situation created a sort of crisis. A crisis that could end in tragedy because traditionally laments were not just important for expressing grief, they were believed to be essential for the deceased to successfully make the transition from the world of the living to the world to the dead. Savelyeva was a strong believer in this tradition, and if there were no one to lament for her, she would never reach her family in the other world. This was a serious concern for PRASKOVYA already in the 1970s. She knew in advance that this might happen. So what did she do? She recorded 7 funeral laments for her own funeral with help of her relatives and folklorists. So she recorded them in advance. These laments are rather surreal. The lamenter is lamenting to herself about her life and death before she has died. The time and effort that went into finding a strategy, organizing the recordings, and having them played at the funeral are a testament to how important laments were in Karelian traditional culture. Now that we have seen how laments were important to lamenters, we can jump back in time again to the 19th century. We have seen how important Karelian folklore was in the 19th century, and now you have an idea of what lament poetry was like and why it was so challenging for Lönnrot to write down, even though he recognized that it was probably important. Other collectors of folklore who came after Lönnrot also saw laments as important, and they brought lamenters into the spotlight as symbols of culture and heritage alongside Kalevala in the 19th century national building project. And that brings us to another story. My next story is about this old Karelian woman, Matjoi Plattonen, from the region of Suistamo, Finnish Karelia. She came from a famous Sotikainen family of Kalevalaic poetry singers. She was married for 15 years until her husband died, and she was left a single mother taking care of their 5 kids at the end of 19th century. She never remarried, and once her oldest son, Ivana, established his own family, she moved in with them and lived there for the rest of her life. She was an outstanding lamenter in her community. She performed laments during numerous weddings and funeral rituals in her village and was highly appreciated by people in her community. She was not only a lamenter, she was also a healer, a midwife, singer of Kalevalaic poetry. She lived in her small village totally unaware of the wave of national romanticism, which had been gaining momentum among the Finnish elite. Enthusiastic collectors of Karelian folklore met Plattonen for the first time in 1900, but they didn't record any laments. They were interested in different types of folklore. Only later she was discovered as an outstanding lamenter by Finnish ethnomusicologist Armas Otto Väisänen, and after that, Väisänen became Matjoi's manager, arranging her performances at festivals and other events. Beginning in 1906, she performed on stage at musical festivals for 2 decades, both in Karelia and in Finland, for example, in Helsinki. The audience of these events were mostly the elite who were fascinated by the exotic songs of this old woman. She met some famous members of Finnish elite, such as the artist Akseli Gallen-Kallela. Matjoi Plattonen met the president of Finland, Lauri Christian Relander, in 1926 and performed the lament for him that expressed her greetings. In 1928, in Helsinki, she performed the lament for King Haakon of Norway, who was very impressed by her song, shook her hand, and asked for the text of her laments to be sent to him. Here in the photo, you can see Matjoi Plattonen in the middle, meeting the King of Norway and other high status persons. Her last performance was in Hungary, in Budapest, in 1928 at the 3rd Congress of Finno-Ugric Culture, where she impressed all of the guests and participants with her original performances. Matjoi Plattonen was also selected as one of the main characters in the ethnographic movie Häidenvietto Karjalan laulumailla, Wedding in Poetic Karelia, which was filmed in 1920 in Suojärvi. She performed in this silent film as a lamenter for the bride, and I will provide you some links to this film so you can watch it. And here I would like to remind you that the elite in Finland back in those days was Swedish and Finnish speaking, and the lamenter Matjoi Plattonen was performing in the Karelian lament language, which is not comprehensible for outsiders. In the newspapers, Matjoi Plattonen was called the mother of Karelia, symbolizing the idea of ancient Finnishness, representing the ancient culture and history of Finns that had been discovered in Karelia. The laments Plattonen performed that were elevated to symbols of culture and heritage were actually just part of her everyday life. There was nothing exotic about them in themselves. Matjoi Plattonen died in 1928 when Finland had been already independent for 11 years. She was called the Last Lamenter, the last pure, authentic lamenter who passed away. But was she really the last, or even just last in Finland? Before my next story, however, I would like to remind you that in 1944, Finland lost a large part of Finnish Karelia to the USSR, and over 400,000 evacuees were relocated into Finland, and among them, 30,000 ethnic Karelians. Karelian evacuees were relocated all over Finland, and relocation in new regions was very hard for many evacuees, Karelian evacuees. They were strangers coming to Finnish towns and villages, speaking a weird language which was reminiscent of Finnish but wasn't quite right. They were mostly Orthodox, while the majority of Finns were Lutherans. They were mocked because of their traditions, habits, religion, and language. Thus, in the 1940s, a widespread process of assimilation of Karelians to Finnish culture began. Many of evacuees didn't want to look strange. Lamenting, for example, in graveyards, vanished in this assimilation process. Among the evacuees were also Matjoi Plattonen's surviving family. The granddaughter of Matjoi Plattonen, Klaudia Plattonen, was relocated as an evacuee to the region of Kiuruviesi in central Finland. Klaudia Plattonen grew up in the lost Karelian territories in Suistamo. She acquired the traditional Karelian ways of life, the most common rituals, songs, and poems. She heard her grandmother's laments, and she knew how much the Karelian laments and lament poetry was appreciated in Finland. Klaudia discovered herself as a lamenter, and her first lament she performed at the age of 36. As Klaudia Plattonen described it, strong feelings of missing her lost home first drove her to lament. And for those laments, her model was her famous grandmother. Klaudia's laments mostly expressed her own grief, and her laments were not initially intended to be performed at the stage. She was just lamenting because she was sad. Later, however, she started to perform at different kinds of small local events and then at larger festivals. Klaudia performed laments with great pleasure for anybody who asked. Like her famous grandmother, she also performed laments for Finnish presidents in 1950s for President Paasikivi, in 1980s for President Kekkonen. Klaudia was mainly recognized as a preserver of the exotic lament tradition in Finland. For other evacuees, she expressed the collective grief over lost Karelia. Some evacuees understood what she was lamenting about in the Karelian lament language. Others, and especially Finns, saw her performances as just one more Karelian thing, of which, luckily, they were tolerant. In the media, Klaudia became called the Last Lamenter, as her grandmother had been. Up until the end of the 1980s, a few other lamenters of Karelian background performed on stage at different local events and also for tourists, representing the exotic and ancient Karelian culture in Finland. These lament performances were quite marginal, especially in contrast to the performances of great Matjoi Plattonen, the mother of Karelia. And generally, those performances remained invisible to the broader public and also to the elite at that time. But at the end of 1990s, Finland experienced a lament boom. Beginning at the end of 1990s, a movement of Neo-Lamenters began in Finland. It was made up of people adapting and reinventing Karelian laments in a modern, mostly urban Finnish environment. The small group of activists found out about traditional lament poetry, and they were fascinated by its expressive power. Most of the activists talked about the idea that modern Finnish people had lost the ability to express feelings, and particularly grief. So in the late 90s, these people started the first courses of lamenting. They wanted to experiment with lament as a way to release blocked up feelings. Neo-Lamenters in Finland have an official registered organization called the Äänellä itkijät, the Lamenters, or literally those who cry aloud with words. Activists of this movement based their knowledge of lamenting on collected archival materials as well as on research literature. So there is now have been approximately 200 lament courses since 2001 and approximately 2,000 participants. They also give courses for teaching lamenters. Some of the establishers of the Neo-Lamenter movement were of Karelian background, but Neo-Lamenters do not want to exclude anybody and invite everybody interested to learn to lament. Their focus is their individual feelings and therapeutic function of laments. And here is Pirkko Fihlman, who is the face of Neo-Lamenters in Finland and who is one of the founders of this movement. She is a public persona, has given dozens of interviews, participated in public discussions and documentary films. She was born in 1937 in Sortavala, one of the lost Karelian cities. Excuse me. When Pirkko, her grandmother was a good lamenter, and when Pirkko created her first lament, Pirkko's mother said that it sounds exactly like when Granny was lamenting. Pirkko performs laments not only on stage or at festivals and concerts, but also during different kind of modern Finnish family rituals, including funeral, wedding, graduation ceremonies, and baptisms. However, Pirkko Fihlman also created laments about important current social and environmental issues. In her lament to Mother Earth, she grieves over environmental issues caused by human beings, for example, the cutting of forests and destroying natural resources. Pirkko sings her laments in Finnish language, but she also uses some Karelian words. Neo-Lamenters try to respect the old traditional language of Karelian laments by using adapted and simplified substitute names in their laments. Neo-Lamenters are mostly well-educated, middle-class, women and men living in the cities. Some of the Neo-Lamenters actively teach the art of lamenting to anyone who wants to learn. There are fewer artists in the Neo-Lament scene, and some Neo-Lamenters or some Neo-Laments are even subject to copyright. Pirkko Fihlman describes laments as holy and able to heal the soul. So the foundation for practicing laments is oriented to self-healing. This movement has created a completely new community around lamenting, a community that embraces everyone interested, irrespectively of ethnicity, language, or religion, focusing on the individual's feelings and often on therapeutic benefits of lament. However, Neo-Laments commonly present their work to the public at large as reviving an ancient Finnish lament tradition. And here again, we can hear the echo of the ideology of building Finnish national identity on the basis of Karelian culture from 100 years ago. This notion of the Karelian tradition being Finnish is very deeply rooted in people's minds. So Kalevala is the symbol of the Finnish nation that everyone recognizes today, but women's laments were elevated beside it, performed for presidents and kings during the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century for the celebration of Finnishness and ancient Finnish culture. By the end of World War II, however, laments had become seen as different, as something Karelian immigrants did to grieve their lost Karelia. When the laments were relocated with the evacuees, they were no longer remote. They were not longer remote where they could be seen as something in the idealized past. They were next door in the present. Today, however, laments are making a return, resurrected and reinvented as a new symbol of Finnishness and Finnish culture that is simultaneously open to embracing anyone, irrespectively of language, ethnicity, or gender. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eila. Thank you. This is truly fascinating, and I'm sure you are opening up a theme that is not all that well known to us American Finns, and not even to everybody in Finland. We have a number of questions, but we'll save those questions till the end. Thank you, everybody, for writing your questions. You can do it on the Q&A function, or you can type them on the chat function. The Q&A comes to the moderators and the panelists, and we'll answer all those questions. In the interest of staying within our schedule, we'll move on and have our next lecture start right away, and then we will go over all your questions, and thank you for everybody for joining here. We have over 140 people, so that's fantastic. So the next lecture is entitled "The Viking Age in Finland." Something that, can you hear?
Yes.
Okay. So here is Frog, and Frog is the lecturer for the second presentation today. Frog is an Academy of Finland research fellow and an associate professor of folklore studies at the University of Helsinki. He specializes in early Finnic and Scandinavian contacts and cultural reconstruction. He received his PhD from University College London in 2010 and an associate professorship from the University of Helsinki in 2013. From 2011 to 2014, he was coordinator of the Viking Age Suomessa project, Viking Age in Finland project, which produced the books Fibula, Fabula Fact, Fabula Fact, the Viking Age in Finland. I love the alliteration, and an alliteration conference is actually where I first met Frog and Eila. so this book we will be posting in the resources the link to the book because it is available open access online. It was published in 2014 and it's co-edited with Frog and Jonas Ahola with Clive Tolley. He has also published another edited book on this topic, The Viking Age in Åland in Ahvenanmaa, Insights and Identity and Remnants of Culture. And this book, Frog has edited again with Jonas Ahola and Jenni Lusenius, and that also came out in 2014. So let me give the floor to Frog and we'll learn about Vikings and Finland. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. And first of all, I just want to thank the organizers for arranging all this. I think it's fantastic to be able to have an opportunity to talk with you about this topic, which is something that's really exciting for me and that I've worked with for a very long time. And it's something that I feel like a lot of people are less familiar with, that they're in terms of simply not having a very clear understanding of what the Viking Age was in Finland. So we can just start off with the basic question. Well, what is a Viking? I mean, because today we tend to imagine Vikings as, big men in furs with horned helmets, roaring around on the seas in square-sailed boats. And the actual square-sailed boats or ships is historically accurate, but nobody was really wearing horned helmets in Northern Europe at the time. This is partly an idea that came out of a really exciting discovery that was made in the 19th century of helmets with horns that looked very dramatic and turned out to actually be from the Bronze Age. So they were a few thousand years too early for the Vikings. And this combined with some of these figures that are called weapons dancers that look like they have something with horns on their heads, although the images that are up there turn out to have faces and seem to be birds, even if what exactly they represent is still a mystery. But no one was actually wearing horned helmets. This is very much a modern idea. And it's very common today to talk about Vikings as though they're some sort of an ethnic group. And this is an idea that's been really reinforced by the modern television series, The Vikings, where the characters talk about the Vikingness of one another, and that, we should be Vikings. We want to be Viking. People should be Viking, as though this is some sort of a clear identity of their community and of their society. They talk about themselves as Vikings. But in Old Norse, the Scandinavian language, Vikingar actually meant something like pirate, and to be I Vikingu, literally in Viking, meant to be on a Viking raid. So being a Viking, it wasn't an ethnic identity. It was more like a career choice or, a summer job. You go off, you make some money, and you come home and study during the winter. But this also, when we look at some of the medieval sources, the ways that this was used, we find that it wasn't specific for Scandinavians. So in the saga of King Olafr Tryggvason, we find the statement that when the young King Olafr and his mother sailed east across the Baltic, they were attacked by Vikingar. Those were Estonian. So they got attacked by Estonian Vikings. And so it's important to recognize that Vikings, the way that the word was originally used, was not for specifically Scandinavians, and it certainly wasn't for an ethnic group. So when we come to this, when we're thinking about a Viking Age in Finland, how does that work? So, because we have two things here that we're bringing together. On the one hand, we have the Viking Age, and what is the Viking Age? Here, this is a question about historical periodization that we need to open up a little bit, because it's the Viking Age is this periodization process is a construction of images of history and its significance for us, and that's an issue that we need to open up if we want to answer this question about a Viking Age in Finland. And the other part of this is, what was what is Finland? I mean, because if we're talking about 1,000 years ago, there were no national borders that define Finland as a geopolitical space today. So it raises questions of geography and of language and the ethnicity of people that we have there. And these are other issues that we really need to take apart if we're going to talk about a Viking age in Finland. So let's first address this question of, well, what is the Viking Age? And here we need to, we need to think that time is a continuum. And when we talk about something like the Viking Age, this is part of the way that we break up history into periods that helps us talk about the past and to think about it. But it's also based on things that we today, or in recent times, identify and interpret as meaningful. We can say that this is an anthropocentric idea of the past. And this means that it's people-centric. It's all about people. So we pull out moments and features of human history, and we the features that we focus on when we talk about something like the Viking Age are linked to culture. And that periodization it's not based on like some absolute thing in time or absolute thing that happened to the world, but it's about culture and what happens in societies and to people in the world. So if we talk about the Iron Age, it only begins when people have iron and are doing things with it. It's not about when iron was first something in the world. It's been around here for millennia before we have an Iron Age, of which the Viking Age is usually considered the last period in the north. And periodization is something that we need to keep in mind that it evolves, so that by talking about a period like the Viking Age, we're in a sense creating that period by the way what we pull out of it as meaningful in the way we talk about it. So, but then, this brings us to, so what? I mean, is this just talking about general abstract things or what? But really, what I want to bring into focus with this is that the Viking Age is a construct, and it's built on how we talk about it, especially how we talk about that today is often built on ideas that are sort of not necessarily fully connected with the past or not connected in ways that are relevant to what we might think about as a Viking Age in Finland. The Viking Age as a construct is a period of Northern Europe. So when we talk about the history of Italy or something, the Viking Age is not relevant at all. And this construct, it is created in dialogue with empirical evidence, and we'll come back to that. It's normally defined in terms of from about AD 800 to 1050, and this is partly linked to sort of key events that are sometimes brought into focus as the beginning and end of the Viking Age. So the first recorded Viking raid, which occurred on an abbey near York, is dated to 793, and this is often treated as the beginning of the Viking Age. And 1066 is the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and this is when the Viking raiders and the Viking forces were considered to be defeated, and that was sort of the end. That's often seen as the end of the Viking Age. But when we look at the Viking Age in these terms, certain features are brought into focus that make, that are seen as what makes this the Viking Age. And this is seeing Vikings as hostile, seafaring raiders. And this is key to our modern images of Vikings. But it's also a perspective from England. The abbey near York, where we have our first Viking raid, is actually only a few hundred miles from the Battle of Stamford Bridge. These are both in York. So actually the framing of the Viking Age is really from the perspective of the people who were being raided from it in the British Isles in many ways. And the ways that it gets framed are looking at Scandinavians as pagans viewed through Christian eyes. And this is the period when we talk about the end of the Viking Age. It normally is discussed in terms of the coming of Christianity and the medievalization of the North, so that we end up with this transition from paganism in the north to Christianity, and then Christianity brings writing culture and medieval knowledge and literacy and so on. And the construction of the Viking as an agent and the Viking Age is something that took place in the era of Romanticism. This is in itself really important for understanding the Viking Age and the way that we talk about it and think about it today. That this was, especially in the 19th century, this was an era for creating national identities, which Eila has just been talking about. But at this time, being Christian was a common European identity. So Europe was a Christian, a broad sort of Christian arena. And Christian nations differentiated their identities from one another according to ethnic and linguistic identities. And now, if Christianity made groups the same in Europe, pre-Christian culture, mythology, and religion became something that these different nations could turn to for symbols to build ethnic and national identities. These were very powerful symbols that they could draw on, and then they were linked to ideologies of the time about how these pre-Christian cultures, these were expressions of the spirit of the folk and mythology and oral poetry and so on. Now, the concept of a Viking really was built up in the 19th century as this sort of brave, independent, adventurous hero who was free of bureaucracy and determination by the church. It was an image that actually the Swedish poet Erik Gustaf Geir, he wrote a poem called The Viking. And this was very important in contributing to this image and bringing the Viking into focus. And this gave, created this image of someone who is capable, reliant on his own strength in this time, the time when men were men and women wore helmets too. And it created the Viking as a symbol of freedom from social determination and from social restrictions. And that is an aspect of the Viking image that has continued through the present day. But it was a politically charged identity that it was really very tightly connected to heritage construction and the sort of creation of a Scandinavian identity and more broadly a Germanic identity. So Scandinavia had a lot of the sources for Germanic mythology and for this medieval sort of pre-Christian culture. A lot of those resources came out of Scandinavia and especially out of Iceland that were also being drawn on by people in Germany, people in the British Isles to construct a sort of Germanic cultural heritage. But this symbolism of the Viking has continued through the present day. So we see the images from that era keep being reproduced. They become used in a number of ways that connect very strongly with identities and images of people today. And we see that even in the series, The Vikings. I think it's quite interesting that the image of Vikings over time seems to keep up with current trends. So the images of the actors or the people who are Vikings in these times have changed to increase it to match their hairstyles with people you might see in a nightclub today. And we see the rise in popularity in tattoos and tattoo art as it becomes this very general, widespread thing. We also see it reflected in representations of Vikings in a way that we didn't, say, 30 years ago. But of course, it's also taken hold in popular culture. We find it reproduced everywhere, and it's actually spread quite quickly in new ways. So we find it in Japanese animation. Of course, there are the Marvel's Thor movies, but even in Legos, which I would of course probably have loved when I was a kid. But here is where we end up with the potential for distance between the way that we construct images of the Viking or Vikings in modern discourse and modern discussion, and the reality of the past. That, you know, part of it is that the equation of Vikings equals Scandinavian, as I said, is false. That being a Vikinger was something that somebody did, and probably only a small portion of the Scandinavian population went on Viking raids. You know, most people were just farmers, and it took a lot to be able to gather a whole bunch of people and leave aside all of your work on the farm and go off sailing at a time of year when you probably had to be busy with crops and things. But the era, what characterizes the Viking Age is a massive increase in mobility, and it's partly related to, or it's greatly related to changes in technology for seafaring, for shipbuilding, and what ships could do. But again, the mobility wasn't strictly just for Scandinavians, even though the explosion of this movement was Scandinavians were very central to this. And it produced this connectivity across the North Atlantic from the Baltic Sea to Greenland. But on top, and that movement in the North Atlantic is where much of our image of Vikings comes from. So that's where we tend to focus. We tend to focus on Vikings as these people who would go out to sea, and they would sort of appear on the shores of an ocean, attack people, and then sail away. But a huge part of what the Vikings were also, or what characterized this period, was also what is called the Eastern route that went through Russia, what is today Russia, into the Middle East. And there, this Viking raiding was not important, partly because, you know, if you're on a river, the question is not where did they go, it's did they go left or right? So these ideas of raiding and, you know, the way that Vikings were active in the Viking Age, the modern images are very much concentrated with these, the kind of seafaring Vikings activity, whereas much of the Scandinavian activity that was concerned or characterized the Viking Age went east and went through these inland waterways, and these we end up with lots of activity related to trade and cultural contacts. And at the same time, these same groups, people were also circumnavigating Spain and going to the Mediterranean Sea. And another big part of this period was Christianization, that we saw the spread of Christianity through the north. And this was the discourse of what made the Viking Age very appealing in the era of Romanticism, was connected to the idea that this was the last pagan era. These were the last adversaries of Christianity. But whereas within Scandinavia, it was really about political centralization, for which Christianization became an instrument. It became a tool politically in many ways. But again, this was not all about and only about Scandinavians. So if we look at what was happening in this era, the connectivity is actually, it's quite impressive. And in many ways, this movement across the North Atlantic to the west, and the movement through the Eastern route to the east, and then circumnavigating Spain, this was actually creating, in many ways, a connectivity that defined Europe, or brought Europe together in the modern sense for the first time in a way that it had not been done before, something that we have actually maintained through the present day. So where is Finland in all of this? Well, usually if we talk about Finland in the Viking Age, people tend to imagine it as, you know, like the southern half of Finland, or maybe the southern 2/3, and then part of Karelia, and then maybe or maybe not the Åland Islands, which are here in this smaller circle there. But when we're talking about trying to get to the Viking Age in Finland, one of the things we face is that there's a big chronological gap between different types of sources. A lot of attention has been paid to archaeological material, especially in the across the last half century. whereas linguistics and folklore and some other disciplines have received less attention. Now, if we look at this little diagram here and the historical cultural environment that we want to get at is the Viking Age, we end up with archaeology ends up with these material outcomes. Things happen and you can dig it up or find it in the landscape or something 2,000 years later. And but there's a big gap. So we end up with synchronic outcomes from historical events, and then we end up with 2,000 years that separate those outcomes from the researchers and the research perspectives. Then in between, we have written evidence that, we end up with church documents and medieval sagas that also produce material outcomes that, might be from 1200 or something like that, that preserve not just a text, but also a material object that may have illustrations and so forth. Whereas linguistic evidence and folklore evidence they belong to intangible cultures. So they get transmitted through generations and they continue on, and we only get evidence of them much, much later. So there was no written language for the Finnic languages until the 16th century. And much of what we have as evidence from folklore was recorded in the 19th and 20th century. So we end up with much richer perspectives where researchers could actually interact with people. But we end up with a huge gap in terms of the distance or the number of centuries that this intangible culture was transmitted before we actually get to the ability to interact and get access to that. So trying to coordinate these two types of perspectives is extremely challenging. And Helena mentioned this Viking Age in Finland project, which was really oriented towards multidisciplinary collaboration. This was a big part of what we did. We brought together a huge variety of disciplines to get different perspectives on what we can and cannot say about the Viking Age and the people there, the cultures, what happened. And we didn't just bring together linguistics, folklore, and archaeology, but we also had things like a paleoclimatologist. So we basically got a weather report for the Viking Age in Finland. It was unusually warm and dry, but it was hard to maintain crops because on a yearly basis, the weather was quite unpredictable. But part of this project, or part of what drove the project, was that disciplines, all these different disciplines had worked apart for a really long time. And the Viking Age had tended not to be brought into focus, although it had been, say, in the first half of the 20th century, and then people got very cautious about combining disciplines and things, precisely because of the problems of how to link the different sorts of data. But linking different types of data you can do all kinds of cool stuff with it. So, for example, the word humala, which means hops, like as in beer. This is something that, well, it might be as borrowed as late as the Viking Age, but linguists can't actually tell. They can see that it's been borrowed, but it could be any time across centuries before that it was used. But this can be combined with evidence of, say, pollen, and that shows in the material record, in the archaeological record, pollen shows when plants began to be cultivated, and hops began to be used and cared for in Finland during the Viking Age. And this is something that we can actually, it makes it probable that hops as a word was borrowed from Scandinavians at the same time that it began to be cultivated. And it makes it likely that cultivating it during the Viking Age is linked to Scandinavian language, because that's where we get the word. So we can do, that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of, one of the things that's a lot of the attention on the Viking Age has centered on the archaeological record, material culture, and we have a lot of things that can distinguish. We can distinguish cultures in Finland that way, such as the The brooches up in the upper right-hand corner here, this type of round brooch is something that's characteristic for Finland for the Viking Age. It's actually it's really interesting in terms of, medieval or Viking Age style, because all the women were wearing these pairs of brooches. But you could see different regional and cultural patterns according. Your cultural difference was not in whether you wore the brooch, but actually what design you had. So the Finnic women in Finland and Karelia were wearing these nice round brooches, and that was something that set them apart, but they were participating in these broader networks of style. Another thing that comes from the is distinctive for Southwest Finland of the Viking Age are these bronze, what are seen as bare tooth pendants, which are interesting because they actually show this is supposed to be a tooth, and the cast bronze actually shows where the string should be wrapped around it. But these are something that we find only in Southwest Finland, and then a couple are around the Gulf of Riga, where we can see that somebody moved. In the same way with you find these characteristic brooches of women, when we find them at the trading center in Birka in Sweden, archaeologists say, the woman who had these must be from Finland. And then, of course, the archaeological record shows us all kinds of stuff, like it shows how people in Finland were participating in international trade networks. Like, these are swords that are the so-called Ulfbert swords, where there's a runic inscription that says Ulfbert on them. Apparently a big fancy brand name in swords from the Viking Age. And also we find, like here, this object on the left this is a fragment of what would be a magical staff, something that is the only example in Finland, but it's a Scandinavian type. So we see sort of Scandinavian magic also being adapted into Finland in these networks. But when we go into those types of practices, like the staff or these bare tooth pendants, we start moving into intangible cultures. Intangible culture, because these connect to beliefs and understandings about the world or how it works, supernatural forces, and so on. And this is what we end up with things like funerary practices, such as a type of, or in the Finnic cultural areas during the Viking Age, everybody basically did cremation. There's one cultural area where you have burial mounds, as in Scandinavia. But otherwise, everybody was doing cremation, and especially what are called cremation cemeteries under level ground, where basically you have an area that's just filled with really big rocks. And after people were cremated, the remains and the things that were cremated with them would be scattered among these rocks. That creates questions about the meanings of individual and collective identity. And but a lot of what you see in the archaeological record are simply the outcomes of practices, not the practices themselves. And here's one of the things that becomes very interesting to think about in terms of what was happening in the background of these, is because a lot of things happen at a funeral. And this is one of the things that Eila was just talking about with us with Finnic lament traditions. And as a common Finnic heritage, we can expect that there were almost certainly lament traditions connected with these funeral practices, because these are funeral practices that spread from Southwest Finland to Karelia, and these are part of the formation of Karelian culture. So alongside these burial practices, we would have performance of laments, and presumably the sort of some significance of laments and their importance for the transition to the other world there. But we could also think about differences between how those practices were at that time versus what we have in the modern times, because one of the things that lamenters often do is they describe the scenes or the processes that are happening at a funeral. And in funerals where laments were recorded, this included things like building the coffin, whereas in the Viking Age, it probably would have had something to do with describing the preparation of the funeral pyre and these things. So it doesn't mean that the practices were necessarily the same, but they would be evolving in relation not simply evolving in isolation, but in relation to all sorts of different practices. But a lot of what we did in the project concerned bigger, sort of broader questions that, like, how do we relate language and culture in the archaeological record? How do we figure out which culture is which? Because archaeological cultures, looking at sort of the way that, you know, where people lived, what kind of burial practices they had, and so forth, it's not as straightforward as it used to be commonly assumed, that you could just say, oh, well, this culture is this, and, you know, they must have spoken that language, and so on and so forth. So we were trying to coordinate evidence of archaeological culture with linguistic evidence, and this includes things like place names, which show us where people spoke different languages at particular times, and what languages were spoken when, say, Finnic speakers first arrived and borrowed names for the things in the landscapes like lakes and rivers. And also we can look at loan words. So what kind of, because when we have words borrowed into a language, it tells you what languages the people they met spoke. So in this period, during this time, the Viking Age is actually the time when what's called Proto-Finnic, or the common Finnic language, began. It was still actually dialects at the beginning of the Viking Age, and began to separate into separate languages. And so in this map here, you can see in southwest Finland, that's mainly where what became Finnish was, and then Karelian ended up over in these areas on the Karelian Isthmus and north of Lake Ladoga. And then what became Vepsian, another closely related languages, was further east. And then Estonia and these areas is where we end up with languages that became Estonian. One of the things that we find from the linguistic evidence is that by the Viking Age, by the end of the Viking Age, actually, the Swedish-speaking populations in Finland, when they started to arrive to Finland in the 1100s, they didn't meet people who were Swedish-speaking or Norse Scandinavian-speaking that they could show a continuity of language from. So actually, all of these areas must have been Finnic-speaking by that time. But most of what was Finland and Karelia during the Viking Age were places where Sami dialects and perhaps other languages were spoken. These were different mobile groups. So mainly the fixed settlement areas were areas where Finnic was spoken, whereas in these mobile groups, mainly what was actually Proto-Sami or what Sami languages come from were spoken in those areas, and possibly other languages. And there's this, in Ostrobodnia, there's a settlement area where it looks like the Finnic culture spread, but it's this sort of burial practices. We have the cemeteries under level ground, but recent research on linguistics has shown that actually they weren't Finnic speaking. It looks like they were speakers of some other language. So that's just kind of a fun fact. But what we have during this time is that this is the time when Finnic languages, or the languages that became Finnish and Karelian, were really spreading. So just before the century before the Viking Age, in the 700s, this is when this so-called Eastern route was opening up. And this was a huge draw east, and this is where Scandinavians are often identified as, you know, the Vikings who went east on the river routes, and they became leaders among the Rus, who became later the word that we get our Russian from. But actually, the people in southwest Finland had been active in trade routes to the east for a long time, and they were also drawn to the east with this opening of trade, this changes in the trade routes there. And that movement seems to be where Karelian comes from. So we actually see the spread of the burial practices, the cemeteries moves on to the Karelian Isthmus and around Lake Ladoga. And the language that became Vepsian which is further east, it's not clear that this actually spread with culture. It might actually have been something that that Finnic language was simply very important for trade, and that people who were contacted, using Vepsian to talk to each other, simply started speaking it as a main language, and that it may have started as a trade language, as a sort of international language, you might say. And the spread of language from this time is actually linked to land use and livelihoods, and then these trade networks that the Finnic speakers started to settle around waterways and places linked to inland mobility. And then they spread from there. And then it was just as a historical process, the Finnics, these Finnic groups they didn't centralize and consolidate power. What happened was that they got caught between the centralization of power from Sweden and that which was in Novgorod, which later became Russia. And basically, as those two developed into larger and larger kingdoms, they just sort of cut a political line that moved back and forth across the centuries, that went through Finland and or Karelia, depending on the year, basically. Now, with the spread of language and culture, we can actually look at language, culture, and religion from later periods and get an idea of what happened, because Finnish and Karelian spread north through all these different areas, and all these Sami speaking groups and other mobile groups, they seem to have been assimilated. And this is reflected quite strongly in by the oral poetic tradition, which was maintained especially in Karelia. It disappeared more quickly in the West, and especially in Western and Southern Finland, whereas in Karelia it was maintained in Orthodox areas. And this includes short epic and Kalevala meter and incantations that were circulated as texts, more like what Elias Lönnrot wanted to collect, rather than laments. And they weren't just stories that people would tell in whatever words again and again. But these were not necessarily Kalevala, which was Elias Lönnrot's creation from them, but they were integrated with practices. And this is where we see the mythology, we can see the rituals, and these rituals and practices were integrated with views of the world, how it worked, how the body worked, how it was understood. And what we see this also, that Karelian lament spread all the way to the north with this. What we don't see is practices that we would identify with Sami being maintained in these areas. So it looks like the use of land was connected with practices, with language, and this was connected with ritual specialists, mythology, and so on. And as that spread, it actually it spread north through Karelia and through coastal Finland. And actually, a lot of those mobile cultures, they weren't simply pushed north gradually. They were enclosed, and they simply couldn't do their mobile lifestyles anymore. And they didn't just shift to language. They went through a whole, almost like a conversion process to the mythology and the type of vernacular religion that was maintained in these areas. So let's just turn to some perspectives, what we could take away from this. When we talk about the question, coming back to the question of, well, was there a Viking Age in Finland, or what was it? This easily turns into the question, were there Finnish Vikings? Which is a slightly different question. The groups in Southwest Finland, they actually were mobilized when the Eastern route was opening. And this is part of where we end up with Karelian culture. But actually their networks became oriented towards the Baltic Sea and towards inland trade in the Southwest. They weren't really strongly connected to the Eastern route after that. And this is also Åland, on the other hand, they were more active in a sense to the east. Karelians, on the other hand, are actually quite interesting because they get identified as raiding in Sweden and even crossing the Scandinavian peninsula overland and into Norway during the 12th and 13th centuries. So they're actually characterized as Vikings, possibly because they were the pagan other of the time, but by Christians in Sweden. And they're actually said to have burned the trade center of Sigtuna to the ground, even though the reliability of accounts is not actually clear. But what we can see in historical records is that Karelians did have a special sort of status in relation to Novgorod. So they weren't simply taken over by the spread of Novgorod's power, and they seem to have retained some authority and done activities in the Baltic Sea, at least, that was different from what we might otherwise have expected. But we also see that they were active on the eastern route, and we see this we see the activity on the eastern route, we see trade and expansion. So we see parallels to the activities of Scandinavians, but in a different direction. So the activity ends up being directed more inland towards Finland and Karelia, what become Finland and Karelia. And actually that orientation is what produces Finland and Karelia as Finnic cultural areas. So Finns and Karelians were not necessarily Vikings, but we do see that the Viking Age was relevant and that the people in these areas did similar things. And here again, we need to remember that the Viking Age was about more than Vikingar as raiders, which was mainly something identified with the North Atlantic, not with the inland river routes. And but this also creates the interesting question that if the Viking Age ends with Christianity, was it longer in Finland and Karelia? Because Christianity actually spread there later, which is one of the reasons that Karelians end up represented as Vikings, essentially, by Swedes, by Christian Swedes. So. And this is, when we look at the Viking Age, when we bring it into focus, it turns out to be, it looks like a pivotal period in the history of the Finnish and Karelian groups, that basically they begin to become mediators of trade with the inland cultures. And that makes Finnic language and culture very important for these inland areas in a way that Scandinavian and Slavic doesn't seem to have been. And that position shaped the future of these cultures and their spread. So Finnic shows up as the dominant language in these regions, or in Finland and Karelia, by the 1100s and onwards for these fixed settlement cultural areas. And even though we can see there are earlier periods where we can say that there's been some sort of Scandinavian immigration and Scandinavian contact, they must have been assimilated, at least linguistically, by that time. And then we have this spread of language and culture, which simply assimilates the mobile groups, so that they start to move over to these fixed settlement livelihoods. And when they become part of that fixed settlement livelihood, especially into the Middle Ages, when that's linked to administrative and bureaucratic things being imposed by different kingdoms, we see that these other groups get assimilated also culturally and in some sense religiously as well, probably owing largely to social economic pressure. And then this advances through the historical period up to the present day. So but then, when this turns us, well, we've got the Vikings and we've got the Viking Age. Oh, that's great. But one of the things about when we talk about it in terms of Vikings, that often, something to keep in mind is that actually that ends up connecting things back to Scandinavia. If we talk about Vikings, and this moves us back into the questions of heritage construction and also the political construction of alignments between different cultures. And this has been going on for a very long time. So images are very, very powerful, and they continue to be, and they get used in a number of ways. and they continue to be used widely. But it's very interesting that this was already done over a century ago with things like Akseli and Kalevala's paintings, which he also used, these sort of square sailed ships and Viking Age type figures. But images of warriors, Iron Age warriors in Finland, interestingly, they will have swords and these sort of symbols of status associated with Iron Age warfare, but they have no horns on their helmets. That's something that's lacking. Occasionally, we actually find shaman drums. Interestingly, the Finnic religion did not use, their ritual specialists did not use drums. We don't have that evidence of that. That's something that's a Sami thing, basically. But these processes continue through the present day, and it's good. It's interesting to look at the Viking Age as a period and its importance for Finnic culture, but also to keep in mind that when we start to bring in, if we start to talk about Vikings, we start to move into connections that may have political implications or be part of discourses that work in different ways of creating cultural connections and creating cultural distinctions, like an image of a helmet with deer antlers and a shaman drum. So on that note, I think I'll just wrap up there. So thank you very much.
Frog, thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. What a treat for everybody to hear these two speeches, two talks, and also see a glimpse of a Finnish garden in your window behind you there, since we can't travel there yet, easily at least. So wonderful. And so we have questions, and we have plenty of time. Actually, we can use about half an hour for the question and answer, and I'm going to let Scott handle most of it, and I'll throw in a question if something comes, like, you know.
And I'll hop over to Eila's computer, so we'll be on one screen.
All right.
Thank you, Eila. Thank you, Frog. There are several questions here, Eila, I'm going to try to pull together as one, because mostly they're asking about connections to other kinds of songs and traditions with laments, for example, to the Sami yoke or to the humppa, or to Ingrian traditions. So maybe you could speak about that. Like how do the laments connect to other ethnicities and other traditions in the region, but also around the world?
For the question, and of course, I could give another lecture about the lament poetry and its connections to the world poetry, or about the Finnic laments. So seriously, laments are found everywhere in the world, like truly. Nowadays, it's, you can find them in Greece, in Balkans, in Indonesia. Frog and I, we were recording laments in Bali. So it's everywhere. And it's everywhere, this kind of sung, grievous poetry used in rituals. It is very distinct. It does not remind any other types of poetry, so I cannot really say if laments are related to humppa. I never, found anything like that. Among the Finnic people, laments are known or were performed in Ingria. There are Vepsian laments, there are Karelian laments, there are Setu people's laments. So all over Finnic people, we have lament traditions. I strongly believe that Finns also had lament poetry previously, maybe before the Lutheran religion, strong influence, but we don't have any Finnish laments recordings. So they were not preserved in 19th century. And all of the Ingrian laments, Karelian, Vepsian, Setu laments, they have the same kind of lament language, the principles of lament language. So we can see similarities among them. Of course, the expressions are different, maybe melody is a little bit different, but we see a lot of common features. About the other genres of, for example, Karelian poetry, we have not Sami yoiks, but Karelian yoiks, which were also performed for their weddings or for the other people and so forth. So language of Karelian laments and Karelian yoiks is similar. And then we can talk about the Sami culture and Sami yoiks. Recently, I think it was the beginning of this year, Marko Jouste, a Finnish researcher on Sami music, published an article, very wonderful and interesting, and he is talking about Sami laments. He discovered in archival materials Sami laments. And he talks about the connection of Sami laments and Sami yoiks. And it's very fascinating topic, very new one. So I'm looking forward on hearing more about it. So did I forget something to mention?
Yeah,
Remind me.
I think you got that. I mean, a follow-up sort of, and this is from Scott Davis, why would a wedding have a lament, which seems connected to loss and grief? Yeah,
of course. We look at the wedding from nowadays perspective. We choose our beloved partner here and marry, and we are happy and all of that. But we need to go back into the traditional understanding what wedding was. It meant that the girl, the bride, was completely disconnected from her own family, completely. So totally removed and she was placed into the family of her husband. Sometimes it was, of course, love from the first sight and this, but sometimes it was just arranged marriage. Sometimes there was no any love or any this kind of nice, beautiful feelings. So the laments were making sure that this transition and departure from her own family, where she was born, into the family of her husband was complete and successful. And of course, it was very grievous if you have to leave your family forever and not necessarily see them much after that. And the young bride never knew what kind of mother-in-law is waiting there in her new husband's home, because the newlyweds usually moved, the Karelians usually had big families or multiple generation families. So the new couple moved to their husband's parents' house. And the head of the family was, of course, the mother-in-law and father-in-law. And the new bride was the lowest person in the family. So it was very, very tragic event, the wedding.
Very, very lamentable, right?
Very lamentable, very lamentable. And the one feature was that usually Karelian bride didn't lament herself at the wedding. There was special older woman who was lamenting for her to make the bride cry and to make everybody around cry about this grievous event. And there was this kind of saying in Karelian language that better to cry at your wedding a lot than after wedding when you are married. So it was actually very nice and was very good that you are crying a lot, because then after that you would be happy, happily married.
It's like you set a really low bar, right? So that anything's got to be better than this the next day.
Yes, exactly.
The Kalevala has addresses this after the wedding at the Northland Farm, the Pohjola wedding. They have these laments addressing the fact that the daughter of Pohjola now has to leave her parents and go and live to these strangers in a strange place.
Yes, exactly. This was the whole idea. But also with laments during the weddings, the closest relatives were kind of, can you say, transferring luck and happiness to the young bride. So, and the interesting part was that so-called crying wedding was only at the bride's house. And then when groom was getting his bride and going back to their new home, the lamenting stopped at all. And there was only the song wedding at the groom's house. They were only singing, dancing, and being joyful and happy.
Throw this question to Frogs from Karen Ba. She'd like to hear more about Finnish as a lingua franca or trade language for the broader region going east.
This is something that it looks like Finnic was, well, basically the areas to the east spoke languages that were closely related to Finnic. And if you're starting off with Scandinavian as your language, then those are really just, you don't even have the vocabulary to count. And this seems to have been something that made Åland very important in trade. So very far down on the Volga River, we see distinctively, near the beginning of the Viking Age, we see distinctively Ålandic burial rituals sort of taking over the local, spreading through local culture. So, and the use of Finnic as a lingua franca seems to have gone as far east as Beloja-Osaro. It's not clear if it went much further than that. Is it important, how important it was beyond that? But that's where we see Vepsian spread to, and the term for what we call the Vepsian, the word we use for Vepsians today, which we see as Finnic speaking, that the people called Vepsian were identified with Beloja-Osaro. They probably weren't originally Finnic speaking and simply started speaking the language. So a lot of this, like what was actually happening in the area, it's still kind of, we have to reconstruct it historically. But we can see the importance of Finnic language for these types of purposes going that way. And a similar question arises concerning the spread of Sami language, which seems to have happened through mobile cultures some centuries earlier. That what is called Proto-Sami language seems to have spread very quickly through a huge geographical area and just picked up all sorts of vocabulary from Scandinavian, from Finnic and things like that, but is probably related to some sort of trade activity, and that it was a useful part of it was a lingua franca. And it's but this is just kind of it seems to have been there seems to have been sort of a southern boundary to it that is where Finnic languages were found, and it went north.
Back to Eila on this one. A question about the modern lamenters. Are they using language that people can understand?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, when this Neo-Lamenter movement began in the end of 90s, there were two schools. The one was saying that no, we have to use Karelian lament language, this specific coded language, in order to really lament and really have a mythic connection with the other world and stuff. So modern Finns must learn the Karelian lament language in order to lament. The other part of this movement, they were saying, no, if we are bringing this tradition into modern Finnish culture and life, we have to use the normal Finnish language. Otherwise, people would not connect with this poetry. They simply cannot express their feelings if it would be some strange language. So for a while they were, split a little bit. But nowadays, it's probably maybe 5 years ago, they started to, connect back. So they found a compromise. So they use Finnish language, modern language, spoken language. But they try to to use a little bit of some Karelian words, or create their own circumlocutions, which might be understandable for the modern Finnish people. So most of the lamenters, Neo-Lamenters, they use normal Finnish language, and the laments are understandable, very understandable. I will provide some links with the Neo-Laments, but on YouTube, it's easy to find if you put Itkuvirsi and Pirkko Fihlman, for example, but I will provide the list. It's very interesting to see and to listen.
That's another question too, with are lament melodies shared among lamenters, or does each singer create their own individual melody, like a signature tune for that lamenter?
Thank you. The melodies of laments, you can see that they are kind of individual. However, laments are following the same patterns or same rules. So it's always descending melody and very grievous. And I'm not the ethnomusicologist, so I cannot describe it very well. And unfortunately, we couldn't play the recording what I had via Zoom. Somehow Zoom didn't like the laments. I don't know why. So basically, yes, every lamenter laments in her own way. The same as with the language, she follows some rules, but otherwise she is free to create. And the same is with the music.
Sort of going back to the Neo-Lamenters, just a question here about, do they use substitute words, or are they just creating, and I guess I'm questions are curious about what language they're in Finnish, but what's the nature of the language that they're using? Perhaps
it's practically most of them using normal spoken language, with not this kind of coded secret language like in Karelian laments, but they might say like kantajani, my carrier, about mother, because it's kind of understandable from the context of the lament, or something like that a little bit, but not much. So it's mostly normal spoken language.
I have a question from Charlotte McDaniel, and this has to do with, I guess, assimilation in cultures, and this may even reflect modern and older sensibilities too. A modern person and contemporary Finnish singing these ancient, or these older traditions. Maybe talk a little bit about this tension then between sort of assimilation, perhaps even between like Karelian identity in modern Finland, right? And older traditions and new Neo-Lamenters and Lamenters. Like, how does that all sort of work together, and how does that apply perhaps to what you're doing as scholars?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I don't see any tensions right now among this kind of general public in Finland. Nobody have any problems like wearing the Viking helmets or I don't know, it's just a part of the globalization probably, that you can, sing whatever you want to sing and perform whatever you want to perform. And among the Finnish, modern Finnish people, laments are mostly seen as therapeutic, as, expression of your own feelings and healing yourself. They are not like in Karelia related to the mythic understanding of the world, or contacting the other world and the dead people and speaking with the dead. So They are like two different things in a sense. But I must say that because we are talking, or how to say, related to the Sami culture, there is strong talk about cultural appropriation, you know, about Sami culture, about Sami costumes, about different aspects of Sami culture, which is very important for Sami people, but it's used in the tourism or whatever entertainment. So I see that nowadays in Finland, some of the Karelian activists are starting to talk about this cultural appropriation issues with the Karelian culture adapted, assimilated, borrowed, or whatever you want to word use, so into the Finnish. So for some of the Karelian activists, and especially youngsters, it's a very, very, how to say, difficult issue. Not only about the Laments, but about the Kalevala. So there is strong discussion about whose Kalevala is. And that's, as researchers, we are not taking sides. Is Kalevala stolen from Karelians? We are not answering those kind of questions. We are looking at the processes, what happened, how it happened, and what people felt about it before and what they are thinking now. You probably have something to add to that.
Yeah, I think just for the the question of the issue of whether there's a tension is part of the reason that there is not an issue of tension is that you don't have sort of Finnish people adapting laments alongside a living tradition where people are identifying with it. And you also don't have a really strong image of, you know, this of say Karelian saying laments are Karelian heritage and these are symbols of our identity or anything. It's just that, oh, people are lamenting. And so there's, and the tension only comes up when you end up like with these younger activists who are saying, this is our culture and this is our heritage. And then that produces it as a conflict. So, and that's the same thing with Kalevala poetry, which is very, so much of Kalevala meter poetry that it deals with mythological themes came from Karelia or from Ingria and these sort of non-Finnish, like the Azorians in Ingria rather than the Finnish Ingrians. But there's not conflicts in those because the people are seeing it, the people who are using it are seeing it as part of their heritage in some way. And there aren't groups that are saying this is ours, this is our heritage and not yours. So there's, and the conflict is only sort of starting to emerge with these discussions of, as the cultural appropriation discussions are spreading to these different groups and and people are beginning to question whose are these really in a very modern era in a current context.
And maybe Eila, so one of the questions is, are young people interested in the modern laments? So one of the questions is, who are the people who are the Neo-Lamenters? Are they young? Are they old? Are they, you know, who gets drawn to these things?
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting because majority are the middle-aged women, like a core group. But then there are very, very old people and very, very young people. And now the youngsters are coming, you know, they are more active, they are more interested, and there are few folk musicians who are performing laments, young people again. And so there is variety of, you cannot say that this is only for the old grannies who are retired and they don't have nothing to do anyway and they want to lament. No, and there are men also. It's not only females who are coming there. So it's very, very interesting. And there is international interest. Yes, the one lament course in Finnish was held in Canada among the Finnish people with Finnish heritage. Then in Sweden and in Spain, because there are a lot of Finns staying there. And what else?
There have been international researchers and artists have also come who don't even speak any Finnish. And I think Pirkko gave a lament lesson or course or something in the US.
And lectures, lectures of laments in US, in Philadelphia. So there is a lot of interest.
How are we doing on time, Helena?
I think we can, if we have more questions. Did we already address the question about where Ingria is?
We did not.
Okay, so Eila, could you address? We have a question about clarifying where Ingria is located in relations to Karelia.
It's more south to the St. Petersburg in present Russia, and between Estonia. So it's like this territory, south to Karelia.
Ingria in the present context is a fairly small geographical area. It's just a sort of coast on the southern side of the end of the Gulf of Finland.
Right. So we still have, if we have questions.
A question from Karen Ba for Frog. If the Karelians were sort of Vikings into Sweden and Norway, did they attack the Sami groups? She says, I have a Sami friend who remembers conflict with Finns attacking the Sami. I'm wondering what the history of the conflict between Finns and Sami is and when it arose.
The question of the question of conflicts between Finns and Samis is that would be a really complex question, because most of what we have records for would be recent centuries. So if you're going back to the Viking Age, this is there have probably been conflicts over centuries and centuries as the basically fixed settlements spread and would interfere with the mobility of these different these mobile cultures, and where they did their fishing, their hunting, and those kind of things. And the conflicts with Sami in the Sami folklore traditions get quite complicated to figure out, because there are a lot of legends about conflicts with different groups, but some of the words that they use for these groups they're like shoulds. So we don't know what, they say, well, they might be Russians, they might be Finns, they might be Karelians. So the ethnic terms get mixed up. So it's very, it's a really tricky issue to sort out, and conflicts with the Sami are going on even, you've got them currently today.
Okay, if I think we have covered a lot of ground, evidence of Finnish lament singing in Finland in earlier times. We kind of covered that already. So this has been just, and the religion, did we address that? Are the laments aligned with any religious traditions or beliefs? You mentioned, Eila, that it's more like Greek Orthodox tradition than the Lutheran tradition, but can we even make those kinds of alignments?
The Finnic laments, so Ingrian, Karelian, Seto, Vepsen, were preserved in the Orthodox areas, because the Orthodox religion was more, kind of whatever. If you're lamenting, we don't care. We won't prohibit it, like. But the other, the Lutheran, for example, they were strictly against all this kind of seeing as a pagan or pre-Christian ways of practices. So the other religions prohibited it very strictly. So we are talking why in Finland we don't have documented laments. However, laments are not particularly linked into any institutionalized religion. It is linked mostly to the pre-Christian religious practices and pre-Christian beliefs. For example, belief of the other world and the world of the dead. Karelians were not viewing, or how to say, in Karelian folk beliefs, you don't have understanding of paradise and hell and whatever. There is world of the living and the world of the dead. That's it. And you can communicate with the other world using laments. That's how the beings in the other world will understand you. So it's this kind of, not particularly religion, but the way of life and understanding of the world.
And it's actually quite, it gets quite complicated to talk about it in relation to one religion or another, because the transition to Christianity was basically when Christianity came to the Finnic peoples. Instead of replacing vernacular religion, they said, well, okay, we're Christian, and they assimilated features of Christianity, and they sort of translated it through their beliefs. But and this is where part of where you have all this Kalevala mythology and so forth, Vainamoinen and the world created from an egg. That's because people saw themselves as Christian, and they saw this as, it all made sense to them. But when you talk about laments and their mythology, their way of thinking about the world, there's actually a gap between that and the same mythology in Kalevala poetry and the incantations and things. So lamenters maintain their own sort of mythic worldview and understanding of the other world and how it worked, that differed from the same stuff that you find in Kalevala poetry at the same time. And they must have been maintaining that for hundreds of years.
Okay, great. You already addressed the Sami taking part in the Viking activities. I believe that was addressed, yes. So it will be on the recording, which will be posted on the FinnFest USA's website. And Karen is asking, are there good ways for US Finns to learn about these issues online with Finnish institutions, or are there good courses for us?
It's about laments or the Vikings?
Laments and the Viking Age in Finland, I think both.
Yeah, I think that there are all kind of articles and books about those kind of issues. So we will provide the links and materials for that. But about the courses, but via Zoom nowadays, probably it's possible to organize. So if anybody wants the Neo-Lament course, you should contact those äänellä-itkijät, the organization of Lamenters. I think that they would love to do that. Definitely. We had people from Ireland coming to learn laments to Finland, but nowadays Zoom, everything is possible.
And probably you could gather a big group to do it.
Yes, well, we have a big group now, so interested people. I think our recording will soon be kind of like closing down. We get the webinar a specific time frame that we can use up, and I think we're approaching that end time. But I want to thank Eila and Frog very much. And when you sent that sources, some people are asking for your emails. If you could add your emails there, if that's okay, or they are easily available if you just go to University of Helsinki and so on. So I thank everybody. A reminder of August 28th, Erik Peltoniemi's music series program. And then in September, we have Tim Frandy talking about the Sami. if anyone's interested, I know there are a lot of people interested in that. And then on November, we have Andrew Nestingen speaking about his work on Aki Kaurismäki's films. So it's a little bit of a different topic, the Finnish film noir. But it all ties together through FinnFest, and thank you everybody a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was wonderful to see everybody. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
And it's still pretty light there in Finland.
Yeah. We have it's after 9 in the evening, and it's still sun is shining.
Okay. Well, everybody have a really good weekend, and we'll see you again. Bye bye.
Have a great weekend. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.